We're lucky enough to have back here Professor Richard Bedford, who for many years has been an independent commentator on the RSE scheme and reflecting back to all of us the evolution of the scheme, the successes, the challenges, and that's what he's also here to do today, as well as share some findings from a recent employer survey highlighting some initiatives that go above and beyond. So please welcome Dr. Bedford. Not grandfather.
By missing out first time, long Vanuatu. Long New Zealand, he got one something, or he call him Language Week. Long this fella week, emi week belong bislama. We want to make him one small something long Vanuatu because long some plenty thing me look long screen here, Vanuatu emi stand out. So welcome or get a man, more woman, or he come long conference here, long Vanuatu. Kia ora ana tātou katoa. It gives me great pleasure to speak as the RSE enters its 20th year. We've already heard from several speakers about milestones, and I want to start my presentation with a milestone as well. One thing that we've been able to do with the data that we've been provided by Immigration New Zealand, by the PALM scheme and by various other sources, is to work out how many individuals, how many people have actually participated in the RSE. 58,000 to the end of December last year. This is a very, very significant number of people. And it's well above the combined totals of all of the workers who've participated in New Zealand's seasonal schemes and other Pacific migration schemes in the past. And here's the first sign of Vanuatu. Of these 58,000 at the end of last year, and it'll be 60,000 by now, a third of them or more have come from Vanuatu. Vanuatu is the rock on which the RSE depends, along with the PALM scheme, especially the short-term PALM scheme. It's been the biggest contributor to both, well, to New Zealand's scheme since the beginning, and it has also been the biggest contributor since about 2019 to Australia's scheme, replacing Tonga. I also need to sing out to Samoa and Tonga. They have made very substantial contributions to the RSE over the years, over 11,000 Samoans and over 9,000 Tongans. But there are the other countries that are involved, not forgetting our group from Asia, and the difference in colour is the men and the women. And the one thing that the RSE probably hasn't been as successful as it once hoped it might be is providing work for women. There are complex reasons around that, but it does need to be noted that the Australian PALM scheme has been far more successful at bringing women into their seasonal program than New Zealand's has. Now, I want to just also touch on a bit of history. And again, it's a history that some of the countries that are involved in the RSE are already involved in. If we say that we have 60,000 individuals from the Pacific and the Asian countries that contribute have been in New Zealand and worked with RSEs over the first 19 years, I think we can say that virtually the same number have been in Australia, even though there's quite a overflow of New Zealand workers going and working in Australia and vice versa. There is a bigger number who go to Australia than come to New Zealand in the seasonal work scheme. If we assume that about 120,000 men and women from mainly the Pacific countries, and Timor-Leste in the case of Australia, have participated in the scheme. These schemes. This is more than the 114,000 Pacific people who were involved in the 19th century labour trade. And this was a very significant labour migration. The point I want to mention here is it is not appropriate to compare the conditions and the work that the 19th century Ni Vanuatu, Solomon Islanders, Papua New Guineans, Kiribati and others did mainly in Australia, but also in other Pacific countries, with the work and the conditions that RSE and palm workers are involved in. And I make that point because a lot of my colleagues in the academic world are quite critical of both of our schemes. In their view, they're forms of modern slavery. And I want to stress that what we've heard today and what we'll hear more about the RS scheme is a very long way away from slavery. But those are the 19th century flows. What about the contemporary situation? Well, at any one time in Australia and New Zealand, we have 20 to 30,000 workers involved in the RSE and the PALM scheme. Both countries collect data on numbers of RSE workers and numbers of PALM workers in the country at the end of each month. Now, the great majority of these people that are here, as I've already said, are from the Pacific, but we mustn't forget Timor-Leste, which is coming into the RSE this year, is involved. That's the second major source of temporary workers in Australia's short-term PALM scheme. Now, the numbers of people that come in vary a bit in the New Zealand case. This is, if you look across month by month, since July 2023 to March, I think it's March or February 2026. The red line is the RSE numbers, and you can see the very, very distinctive seasonal pattern there. And the white line is the short-term PALM numbers over the same months. And you can see there that there is a bit of a seasonal ripple, but it's nothing like as significant as in New Zealand. The countries that provide labour to both countries are similar. In the Western Pacific, which is the green section of those graphs, it's Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Papua New Guinea. And I've already mentioned the anchor in that particular region is Vanuatu. In the Central Pacific, it's Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Nauru, or Nauru, they've changed their name. And they've been a very important share of workers in both countries, more so in Australia than in New Zealand. And then the Eastern Pacific are the other anchors, Samoa and Tonga. Tonga, especially for Australia, Samoa and Tonga in New Zealand. Samoa is important in Australia, but Tonga has been the main one. And then finally, the icing on the cake in Australia is Timor-Leste. That's the Asian component, where it really is like icing on a cake in New Zealand, the small numbers that come from the Asian countries. And in the presentation, which you're welcome to have afterwards, you will find the numbers from each of the countries in, I think it's March 2025. And they're very similar numbers to the numbers that are here in March 2026. And that leads me on to an important point that I think we need to bear in mind in our 20th year as we get into it. And that is that seasonal labour migration is extremely age and gender specific. Since about 2019-20, 90% of the workers in the RSE have been men. There are a bit of some variation, and I've got there the shares of women who are for the three big sources, about 7% from Vanuatu, Tonga's on a higher percentage, around 10, and a very, very low share from Samoa. And there will be cultural reasons that are important in that context. But the important point here is that this type of gender discrimination, if you like, or gender bias, means that you have a very significant impact of the RSE and the PALM scheme on the male labour forces of the sending countries. And I've used the example of Tonga because we've recently completed a lengthy country report on Tonga, and we'll do one for each other Pacific country over the next few months. The 9,100 Tongans who've had experience of seasonal work in New Zealand, 8,000 of them are men, and just over 1,000 of them are women. And the important point that I want to make here is that these 8,000 men that represent 44% of Tonga's population, male population aged 20 to 49 years over the period of the RSE scheme. That is a very high exposure in Tonga to the RSE. And in the case of women, it's just 5% of the women have had that experience. And Tonga's census in 2021 showed that 93% of the named communities in that census, and there were a lot of them, 93% of them had households with workers in Australia or New Zealand, or had been in Australia and New Zealand. So this, I won't go into detail here because we're going to run out of time, but what I've tried to do here is to track right through the scheme the age distribution of RSE workers. And in this case, it's men from Tonga. So we have the first 6 years, 2008 to 2012. The next block around 2017-19, which was a very important growth period in the RSE, and then the post-pandemic period. And the point that I want to indicate here, in Tonga's case, is that we didn't find what we expected. We expected the labour force to age as more and more workers kept coming back year after year after year. But in fact, Tonga's RSE labour force hasn't aged. If anything, it's got younger. And you'll see that the green bar, which is the latest period, it's really grown. This is the under 20-year-olds. Now, they're significant because they can't participate in Australia. Australia has an age limit, I think, of 20 or 21 on the PALM scheme, but anyone over the age of 18 can participate in the RSE. So I want to just shift now briefly to what's been happening in the RSE since the pandemic and ask the question, has the RSE plateaued? Has the demand for RSE workers plateaued? And have we reached a kind of equilibrium now? And if we have, are we actually making it clear enough to our Pacific partners that there isn't much growth in the RSE? Well, what's the evidence? Well, the evidence is, if you look pre-COVID, the yellow on the first graph refers to people arriving in the country. Those are the workers. And the red takes that out to the cap. So the red is all the yellow, really, plus the bit that's on the end, because that's what the cap allowed for in terms of workers. If you look before the pandemic, there's hardly any red, and that's because we've reached the cap. And in the years before the pandemic, there was endless argument at RSE conferences like this one about the cap. What should the cap be? Well, in the post-COVID period, we've ended up with a situation where we've got a much more generous cap than actual demand for workers, or supply in the case of people coming in, requires. So the yellow bit is reproduced over on the next graph in as males and females, or men and women, and you'll see that in the post-COVID period, the lines have sort of shrunk a little bit, or there's very little change. Around 17,000 a year have been coming in each year since the pandemic ended, whereas before the pandemic, you were getting growth every year. And here's a couple of examples from particular countries, Vanuatu and from Samoa, our two biggest sources. So the pattern isn't because of one country, it's actually fairly general. So where do we go from here? The key thing I want to stress in finishing is something which I know RSE employers who are here have heard me say many times before and probably bored to tears with it. There's no such thing as business as usual in RSE. And the previous sessions that we've had that have explained some of the initiatives and changes that are taking place in the scheme, and hopefully we'll hear some positive ones from the Minister about the policy review, indicate that it is a very dynamic system. It's situated in a very complex set of relationships. It's far more, as our last speaker said, than just about an employment relationship, about earning money and taking the money home. So one of the questions that we have to ask is, we've got our largest source countries, Papua New Guinea and New Zealand's recently agreed to bring labour from Timor-Leste, Fiji with 1 million people, Solomons with about 800,000, 900,000 people, Papua New Guinea with over 10 million people, double the size of New Zealand's population. In those countries, there is growing demand for more work. We have to be very, very transparent and clear in our discussions with LSUs and others that the demand side, both in Australia and New Zealand, because Australia's PALM scheme has also plateaued. These are not schemes which are just endlessly going to be able to provide additional work. There's also another change or trend. The numbers of new growers entering the scheme is dropping. So that's another sign that we may be reaching some kind of threshold in terms of demand. So what these graphs show, in the red line is the new RSEs that start each year, and you can see the great big bubble right at the beginning. Then it drops down very quickly after a couple of years, sits pretty flat at about 5 or 6 new ones a year. Then there was a bubble in 2017, 18 through to the pandemic, collapsed of course in the pandemic. Then there was a very sharp increase in RSEs in 2021, 22, 23, catching up straight after and getting involved straight after the pandemic. But now we're down to maybe 2 or 1 new RSEs entering the scheme a year. And interestingly, the green line shows you the RSEs that were recruiting last year. So the RSEs that are recruiting in any given year are RSEs that have been in the scheme often right from the beginning. The blue line on the graph on the far side shows the number of RSEs that stop recruiting. There's always RSEs each year that disappear from the list. And they're the ones that have either been absorbed by another RSE, and there's quite a few of those that go on, or they're RSEs that have just chosen no longer to participate. And then finally, I want to finish with exactly the same message that we've heard from our last 2 speakers. The RSE is far more than work. And I want to commend TVOM for running a pilot survey last year, asking RSEs if they could say a bit about what they have done to support their workers above and beyond paying a reasonable wage, providing good accommodation and all the other things that are expected of an RSE. And it was surprising. Over a quarter of the 174 RSEs reported doing additional things. And some of these are really big things. These are things like building a preschool in a village, building a house for a doctor in Vanuatu in a village in Epi. Recovery from cyclones and damage caused in natural disaster was probably the most common one. But equally, there was another very important one which builds on some of the things we heard in the last speaker, and that's helping people with their businesses and investing in their businesses. And I would hope that as we're going into our 20th year, that TVOM will think again of approaching RSEs to learn more about the extra things that they're doing, because the RSE is a lot more than an employment relationship. Thank you too much.